What's interesting about tariffs are the benefits are visible and the costs are hidden. So as a consumer at first, we may be thinking, well, it's not going to affect us that much. But again, eventually these costs are going to show themselves. And that's the risk of the trade conflict. I'm Lawrence Duke, and I'm clinical professor of marketing and international business at the Lebow College of Business. If we look at the China-U.S. trade conflict, the main arsenal, if you will, that the Trump administration is using is tariffs. The objective is to try to reduce the large trade deficit that the United States has with China, which approaches $500 billion. Trade deficit is the difference between imports and exports. So in the case of China, they're running a big trade surplus with the United States, so they're exporting more to the United States than they're importing from the United States. I'm a big fan of Lord Maynard Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and he was one of the forefathers of setting up the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, because he felt that the economic conflicts between countries around the world would be, if those could be ameliorated, it would mean less chance of a world war in the future. Now, he believed that you don't want countries to have too big surpluses, but you don't want them to have too big deficits. And that there are times where a trade deficit can be good for a country. So in other words, if you're running a deficit where you're importing lots of investment goods that are going to lead to increased exports later on, then that's a deficit that makes a lot of sense. But if you're running a deficit that's going to lead to increased consumption, and in a sense, bubble levels type of consumptions where they get very high, then that would not be a good type of deficit. I guess in this case, if we look at this situation, a close to $500 billion trade deficit with China, I think it's fair to say that that's pretty high. Now, it's fine for the United States to run a deficit given the fact that the economy is doing very well, but you get up to $500 billion, close to $500 billion, that may be seen as being a bit too high, even the fact that we're growing, at a very high rate. Tariffs are one way that can be looked at to be able to reduce that deficit, but at least in the short term, it'll probably lead to a wider deficit. Every country has tariffs to some degree. It's just that this is sort of a situation where they've been increased a lot on so many categories by two of the top economies of the world in terms of their size. And so that's what the big concern is. The advantage of tariffs is for the protected businesses in those categories. Those businesses will benefit from that. But what the average American consumer is going to be facing, they'll incur more of a cost to it than what the benefits would be to those businesses that are being protected from the tariffs. If we look at over a year, for example, these tariffs are put on, it could potentially involve $1,000 cost to the average household. To put that in perspective, President Trump's tax cuts were about $900 per household, so it would effectively neutralize those. This trade conflict has downside risks for China as well. If we look at China's economic growth, over the past couple decades, they've had very high levels of economic growth, and they've become a very significant economy, second largest in the world. Now, with this trade conflict, that's going to dampen a lot of these trends that we've seen very dramatically. The longer economic growth stays low, it could lead to higher unemployment. They have a huge population, and unemployment will hit them pretty hard. And that's a concern for the Chinese authorities, that how they're going to be able to handle that. I think when we look at the impetus behind putting on these tariffs, there is a political factor that's involved with it, as well as a business factor. And the political factors that show that, we're being tough with those countries where we have a huge trade deficit. So we want to be able to show that we're taking action to try to reverse that. But if we look at the economic impact, it's going to be more of a cost to the average consumer. And also with respect to reversing the trade deficit, it's not going to have very much of an effect. And if anything, it could widen the deficit more. But we're hoping that through the negotiations that we can encourage the Chinese to purchase more American goods.